Social anxiety disorder. You guys tired of hearing about that? Social anxiety disorder. Let me tell you what it is, real quick. Oop, hold on. Social anxiety disorder is an intense, persistent fear of being watched and judged by others. That's what is said. That's the National Institute of Mental Health's definition that I pulled from the internet. Just some stats on this, just to frame this for us for a second. Approximately 15 million adults in the United States are now currently diagnosed with social anxiety disorder, and that's growing. It's a total of 7.1% of the population. It's an increasing number every single year. It is something that is greater among teenagers than adults. They don't technically do surveys for teens and medical issues like this for various reasons. So they suspect that the number for teenagers that have social anxiety disorder is much greater than the surveyed adults. For those that are surveyed that they have data on, they say that most people who have social anxiety disorder begin developing symptoms of social anxiety disorder at 13 years old. So right at the beginning of the onset of the teenage years is when the social anxiety disorder symptoms begin. And the stats show that this is an increasing thing every single year. That what it was years ago is not what it is now. It is progressing and increasing every single year. One study in particular showed that in 2005, the reported rate of those that are having diagnosed social anxiety was 12%, and in 15-year period of time, it is now at 58%. And that's in 2020. And I don't know if you know what happened from 2020 to 2024, but I feel like the number's higher nowadays. Now, let me just give you some details on this just so you can have some info, and this might be hard to see for you, so I'll read it, but this is from the Mayo Clinic. Here's some emotional and behavioral symptoms of social anxiety disorder. Fear of situations in which you may be judged negatively. Worry about embarrassing or humiliating yourself. Sometime I'm 2 for 2 so far. Intense fear of interacting or talking with strangers. Fear that others will notice that you look anxious. Fear of physical symptoms that may cause you embarrassment, such as blushing, sweating, trembling, or having a shaky voice. Avoidance of doing things or speaking to people out of the fear of embarrassment. Avoidance of situations where you might be the center of attention. Anxiety in anticipation of a feared activity or event. Intense fear of anxiety during social situations. Analysis of your performance and identification of flaws in your interactions after social situation, expectation of the worst possible consequences from a negative experience during a social situation. Sounds like me before I preach in the main service. Okay. Here's some physical symptoms here. Physical signs. Blushing, that's a physical sign. Fast heartbeat, trembling, sweating, upset stomach or nausea, trouble catching your breath, dizziness or lightheadedness, feeling that your mind has gone blank, and muscle tension. Yeah, that's just called stress, I think. Did you say menopause? Yeah, that could be. Yeah, we're not going to go there. If you have social anxiety disorder, you have those emotional symptoms, you maybe have those physical symptoms, and then this is what happens in these situations. It may be difficult or hard for you to interact in various situations, including interacting with unfamiliar people, attending parties or social gatherings, going to work or school, starting conversations, making eye contact, dating, entering a room with people who are already seated, returning items to a store. That one's weird, returning items to a store. Eating in front of others, also weird. Using a public restroom. All right. How many of you, if I just read this list and gave you some definitions, probably could diagnose yourself with social anxiety disorder at some point in your life? Raise your hand real quick. Okay. How many of you right now would based off of this definition, you could in some sense diagnose your own teenager with social anxiety disorder? Raise your hand, just so we can be, okay? All right. This has become a thing in society where we have taken what is normal responses to human interactions and we have turned them into a diagnosis that makes it so that we justify people's inability to engage with other human beings, is what's going on. Now, I understand that patterns of behavior can actually cause physical changes, physiological changes in the brain that sets up patterns for responses, and that's what often is diagnosed under these circumstances. But at the base root of things like this, disorders, mental health disorders, including one that is arguably incredibly easy to diagnose, what we have done is we have given our teenagers in particular a pass on their responsibility to engage with other people in a useful, effective, godly, and productive way. And this has become such a common thing in society, in the culture at large, that we need to be, as a group of Christian parents, just aware of the cultural trajectory of where this is growing. An increasing number, more adults, more teenagers, easier to diagnose. This is going on all the time, and it's becoming a thing like we talked about in hard work. I am anxious, I have a hard time at work, therefore I have a diagnosed mental disorder, I have social anxiety disorder, therefore I can't go to work. It affects many aspects and functions of life. This is one aspect of engaging with society. All of us as believers, and we want our kids to become believers and be an effective tool in engaging in society. If our kids have an excuse or a reason in their mind that they cannot engage in society, they're not fulfilling God's call or purpose for them. Now, you might be sitting here, and I know some of you are, because you're saying, my kid doesn't have this problem, right? My kid is not socially anxious. My kid is the opposite of this. So here's another definition that I put together for you. Here it says, social annoyance disorder is an intense, irritating, and bothersome personality that has no social awareness or concern for others. It's really small print, but that says Pastor Doug underneath there. That's my name. I came up with this one. Whether your kid is on the spectrum of, I am so afraid to talk to people, I'm terrified, I shut down, I can't communicate, or I will talk to everyone and anyone and annoy everybody, and just keep going and keep going and keep going, and I have no awareness of what's going on. Either one of these spectrums that your kids are on, that the society seems to just now accept as that's the normal behavior, is the oddities in the group, the far fringes of people. We need to be able to look at this in a little bit of a better light, a more biblical light, and say, what is it that God expects of us and our kids in terms of how we engage in society? What is the social compact and requirement that God has for us to engage in society? Okay. First and foremost, let me put it this way. We have to engage with people. God has called all believers to engage with people. The Great Commission itself has 4 different types of imperatives here that are all connected to doing stuff with other people and being effective in doing that. You can't make disciples unless you can talk to them, engage to them, look at them, communicate with them. You're not going to have a relationship with them to baptize them. You're definitely not going to teach them, and you're called to go out to them. It's just fundamental in the call of all Christianity that we are supposed to be people who are engaged in the world, not of the world, but in the world with other people for their benefit, to be a minister of the gospel and to see other people become disciples. This is inherent in who God made us as people. He created us within society and culture to engage in relationships and to do so in an effective way. So we don't want the outcasts on either side of the spectrum, those that cannot engage with people and those that are so weird they cannot engage with people. Even more so, I would say this from Titus, we are called to be people who represent Christ in such a way. And the way that it's put in many, many passages is something like this. Show yourselves in all respects to be a model of good works. Like you're to be an example to other people. And in your teaching, show integrity. Be a person who teaches what you say is important. And in this case, pastorally, to teach what is true. But even for the teenager, if they are declaring the things of God to their friends, to show dignity in their teaching, integrity, honesty, and sound speech that cannot be condemned. That there has got to be something about their general demeanor and what they say that provides for them some sort of effect in people's lives. And in this context, it says, what's the effect? Well, the effect is that an opponent may be put to shame. So that when other people come and slander your kids and say, this Christianity thing, it's a joke, you don't agree with it, you're a hypocrite, your church is full of hypocrites, it's not true, believe in this, believe in that, this is my philosophy, accept my philosophy. They can say nothing against them because they've shown themselves to be a model in their engagement with others, having nothing evil to say about any of us. And ultimately, which is the passage that I want to use as a platform for tonight, to look at a passage like Colossians chapter 4, and it says, what are we to do with those on the outside of the church? What is the goal for all of us? We're to walk in wisdom. We're to be models and examples of wise engagement with people on the outsiders. And we're to buy back the time. We're to maximize the time. We're to make the best use of the time that we have while we're here, not throwing it aside and saying, it's too hard, it's too difficult, or I'm too weird, I'm too different, I'm too unique. No, we're to take hold of it, to buy it back, to redeem that time and to utilize it. And then the very next line in this passage is, so then what are we to do? Let our speech always be gracious. The way we engage with other people, our talk, it's to be seasoned with salt. It's this idea that we are salt and light like Jesus calls us to be, and we have a preserving effect. We have a helpful and useful effect. We're winsome and persuasive, and we're engaging, and we're out there with the intent of answering each person. When people are talking to us and they're giving us information, how are we to respond? We're to do it with graciousness and kindness and winsomeness, and we're to seek to win others to Christ, and we're to be salt in our conversation. It's to be good. I mean, the intent of our social engagement, biblically speaking, is you should be really good at engaging with other people, and our kids tend to not be. Our kids tend to be awkward. They don't know how to engage. They don't know how to keep a conversation. They cannot speak to an adult. They don't know what to say, what to do with their hands. They look down. They can't look at you in the eyes. They don't know what to do. If we are called to be people who, under the rule of the Great Commission and the general principles given in the New Testament about how we engage with people on the inside and the outside of the church, we need to be better at training our kids to engage with other people socially. So when I say speak up, when I use this as a little phrase for your kids, what I mean is you need to teach your kids to engage with other people's socially at a better level. Teach your kids to engage better at a social level. So I want to give you the first point because we've already covered most of it. For you as a parent, this is what I want you to do. I want you, first and foremost, to evaluate your teen's social ability. Every single one of you, you've got a kid in your home, whether they're preteen or teen or whatever the age they are, you can know on the basis of how they operate, where are they at on this spectrum of diagnosed social anxiety disorder, weirdo, or able to communicate with people, right? And I'm sorry if I put your kid in either one of these camps. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm trying to give you extremes, all right? So I want you to evaluate your own kid, and I actually wrote some couples questions for you this week on your back of your sheet for you to talk about this with you and your spouse to evaluate each one of your kids in this area. But let me just break this down for you, those two categories again that we talked about. If your kid is prone to social anxiety, we don't want to just say, now I'm going to evaluate my kid. My kid tends to be someone who's socially anxious. They don't want to engage with others. They want to isolate. They want to get into their little hole and just hide, and they feel awkward and fearful when they're in front of other people. We're trying to work through that. I want to point out the things that I think biblically speaking, make the most sense for the reason why this is for you to address. So if your kid has something like social anxiety, let me just say what's probably going on is they probably have a heightened self-perception. Well, what they probably have is that they're dealing with, they're focusing so much on themselves and their flaws usually, that they're so hyper aware of everything that's wrong with them that they project onto others that everyone is reading them the same way that they're reading themselves. And this makes perfect sense in the context of all teenage interaction. I don't know if you remember what it was like to be a teenager, but teenagers are brutal to each other. If you have one single hair out of place on your head, someone will make a joke about it, okay? They will highlight every physical problem with you. They will make comments about every nuance of your speech patterns. They will talk about your dress, your clothes, your family, the car you show up in, how dirty things are. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. That the tendency of teenagers is to highlight and emphasize the flaws in other people. And especially with the rise of social media and the perfect life that is presented in social media, now we have an even more drastic comparison between the perfect filtered people and me. And so everything that is happening right now in culture is combining to heighten our own teens' awareness of their flaws, of their failures, of their hiccups, of their mess-ups, of everything that they do wrong. And so if you have a kid that is leaning towards the social anxiety spectrum, it's likely that your kid is just too focused on all of the negative things that they see in themselves. In response to that, there's many things that you can do. One of the things you can do is just tell them the things that they're good at, right? There's lots of responses to this, but if we're not aware of this trajectory of the culture to highlight this and heighten it for our kids, then we're not going to be able to fight against it. So we need to be aware of that. The other thing that people with social anxiety tend to have is an increased fear of man. They tend to think the worst case scenario is if this person thinks a bad thing about me. And that just keeps seemingly getting worse and worse and worse, where we're highlighting it with social media. If you don't get enough likes and hearts, then you're not good enough. And if you get one negative comment, that outweighs the 100 positive comments about whatever you post. You tend to emphasize this, and you are so in the place in life as a teenager where you want to be cool, you want to be seen, you want to be accepted, you want to be valued, that you are so afraid to damage or ruin your own reputation that people just become shells of themselves, and they just don't operate. And so if you're a Christian parent trying to work your kid through social anxiety, you probably need to help them with their own self-perception that they're just not the worst thing and the ugliest thing and the most despised thing anybody's ever seen, and you need to help them work through their own fear of man, because we're not called to have a fear of man. Okay, I've got to race through this because I already have too much. That's if they have social anxiety. What if they are the socially annoying one? I'm sorry, I don't have any other better way to put this, okay? If they're the socially annoying one, I would say that their issue is probably they lack self-perception. They are not realizing that as they are engaging with other people, that the other people are annoyed with them or bothered by them or want to not talk to them, and they're not seeing that engagement happen, and they don't see themselves any different than any other people. And this is not good either. We don't want to be people who don't know what we're like in front of other people or how other people perceive us. That's bad. So one person is looking and saying, I'm so aware of what everybody's thinking about me when no one's really thinking about them. And the other person is out there going, I have no clue what anybody is thinking about me. And I'm saying, you should probably care a little bit about what people think about you, because people are thinking weird things about you, right? We want to meet in the middle here and say it is appropriate to have some level of concern of how people perceive you and how you engage in a society and a culture. That's helpful. But most of these people, they don't have a fear of man problem. They don't care what other people may think of them. They go out there and say, I said this, and if they don't like me, whatever. But there should be a sense for this person that they do have a fear of God, because the way we engage with other people we should want to do it in such a way that we are pleasing to God in our engagements. And if everybody we come in contact with gives us the kind of stiff arm, I don't want to deal with you right now because you're bothering me, then that's not good either. We want to strive to be more effective at engaging with people, engaging with people. And so we got to work on an increased fear of God to say, okay, maybe you don't have a fear of man. I'm not going to try to increase your fear of man to some degree, but I do want you to care about what God thinks about your engagements with people. And so don't just be flippant about this and think it doesn't matter. It does matter, because it can increase your effectiveness and your communication and your winsomeness and your ability to communicate the gospel and your ability to make disciples and your ability, even if you want to think about it from a worldly perspective, to get a job, to keep a job, to get a spouse, to do anything in this world. It has benefit. So you should grow. So the first things first. At some point this week, sit down with your spouse and say, hey, I'm going to look at this. What side of the spectrum of is our kid on? What is their tendency? What are these things that they struggle with? How can we work on that? All right. The second thing is this, I would say, you need to consider your teen's social influences. If you want your kid to be better at engaging in the way God calls us to engage in a society, we actually have to ask the question, what are the things that are influencing it? I mean, what are the contributing factors to their problems when it comes to their social engagement? And I don't expect any of your teens to be experts in social engagement, and so it's not like we're looking for the perfect remedy here, but we can all see to some degree that there are things in our kids' lives that are making it more difficult for them to be where they need to be, to appropriately, respectfully, and effectively engage other people, all right? The one that I've already mentioned that we have to just talk about for a second is this is becoming a problem because of the devices, the technology that we have. Everything that I read is pointing to this direction and saying, the more we are on a screen and the less we're with people, the worse we become with people and the more social anxiety we have, right? Or the more odd we become because we're becoming like the people that are kind of odd on the screens. It goes both ways. So there is a contributing factor here when it comes to your kids' usage of devices, screens, social media, all this stuff all the time. If you're seeing my kids kind of locked into this weird framework where they struggle with this or that, if they're playing hours and hours of video games and they're on a headset with their buddies all night, or if they just can't be in a social environment with 3 of their girlfriends without pulling out their phones and showing them what someone else has done, then we're just lessening the time that they have with engagement with other people that will train them to engage with other people. They're learning how to engage with other people via the screen. And this is the thing that our teenagers are getting wrong all the time. They think it's the same thing. They think that engaging with a human face-to-face is the same thing as engaging with them screen to screen. And I think you can all nod your heads with me and say, it's not the same, and we see the difference between you as a teenager and how we engage as a culture that grew up without smartphones, right? So you need to think about your kids' usage of these things in terms of the social impact it's having on them and their ability to be effective. The other thing that is obvious, I think, is you need to evaluate and consider their friendships. Do they have friendships where the friends that they're spending the majority of their time with are disrespectful, they're bad in their words, they're not winsome in their speech, they don't honor you as their parents or their parents, they use coarse or bad language, they are disrespecting the authorities around them and their teachers and slandering and gossiping. If you have teenagers who have friends that are doing this and that's their influence, that's what they're going to learn to be like. And I've got questions for you on that as well to consider all of this and maybe what it looks like for you to be wise in encouraging friendships with kids that are representing these skills in a way that we want them, how we want our kids to act. Okay, last but not least here on this one. How much time are your kids spending in actual conversations and engagements with adults? It is imperative, if you want your kids to learn how to be someone who engages in a society full of adults, that they learn at some point, especially in the teenage years, how to engage with adults by having regular conversations. I would say it first starts with you. When you're in the car, have a conversation. I know it's hard to talk to a teenage boy, and at house school, it's fine. Okay, what happened today? Nothing. Okay. But you got to give them an opportunity and increase opportunities. Sometimes they'll open up at times that you might not expect or you don't anticipate. There are moments that you need to strive to just do more of engagement. Specify family times. I mean, say we're going to sit down and we're going to talk. We're going to go for a walk and we're going to have a conversation about this. You have to engage with your kids. They have to get used to you, and they have to get used to you speaking to other adults as an adult to see what it's modeled like. Just as an example of this, I don't know what's my family. We're in a phase. Okay, I don't know how to say it right now. We're in a phase. We are really in a Little House on the Prairie phase. Okay, we are watching every Little House on the Prairie episode. And we are reading the books as well, okay? We're going for it. We just read the second Little House on the Prairie book, which is not called Little House on the Prairie, but we just read that in the car on the way to the zoo the other day. And just the comments in the 1800s, this is when I think this is, I don't know, early 1900s, about what it was like when kids would sit at the dinner table with their parents. Now, back in those days, children, and I mean like children, were not allowed to talk at all. They weren't allowed to speak when there were adults at the table. They had to sit and they had to listen. And they were to perceive and engage and act respectfully and and be just yes, thank you, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. That's it. That's all they were allowed to do. But as soon as they became a certain age, they were expected automatically to be treated as adults, to communicate like adults, to engage in adult conversation. And we have lost this in some sense in our society, where we allow our kids to act like kids when they're engaging with adults all the way until they're 18 years old, and then we expect them to flip a switch and act like adults when speaking to adults. But they've never been an adult and they've never conversed like an adult. If you want your kid to be able to engage in a society full of adults as they're teenagers, you need to make sure that they're around adults and know what appropriate, good, effective adult conversation looks like. They need to hear you and your spouse talk and engage with each other, hear you and your spouse engage with other people in the church and in your small group and in your fellowships and here on the patio. You need to make sure they're doing that with other adults, with family members or friends or people they're comfortable with, and with you. That's got to be the expectation. And if your kids are not spending enough time around some adults, maybe they need a little bit of adult time just to learn some of this. It doesn't have to be every second of their life. They want to be away from you. I understand that. But they need some time to learn from you of what it means to socially engage like an adult. All right. Lastly, I would say this. You should be, as a parent, in the midst of this craziness where everybody's expected to be not socially skillful, you should work to develop social skills in your kids. This is something that will benefit them, worldly speaking, and in terms of a Christian perspective. The more effective someone is going to be in just being able to have a conversation, sit down, speak up, say the right words, the better they're going to be. And so you want to develop those skills. So this is a long list that we cannot possibly go over. And I know you're already thinking in your head, my kid's not good at this. They need to grow in this. They need to be better at this. So I know it's already there to some degree. And with some time, you can get all that figured out and write it down on a piece of paper and work on it. But let me give you just a few things, biblically speaking, that are important to social engagement, okay? So here's a few things. Your kids need to know how to control their mouth. They need to be able to know how to be quiet when it's time to be quiet and to withhold comments and statements. It's one of the first principles of wisdom is that someone knows how to guard their mouth, to keep their tongue, to hold their tongue. It's a restless evil. It's full of deadly poison. The wise and effective person who has any care for biblical principles about how we engage is we need to be careful with what we say because our words are important. If your kid is someone who likes to just throw things out and say whatever's on the top of their mind or emote and vent or do whatever, you need to put some restraint on that because they're not learning this valuable biblical principle and social skill to be wise with how they use their words. Next one I'd say is this. Your kids need to learn to listen to other people It is well known that teenagers have opinions. They're arrogant. They think they know what's right, even though they've lived a very small amount of time in comparison to you. They have less wisdom, and yet they want to say what they think without listening to what other people have to say. So they should learn the biblical principle of hearing a matter out, asking questions, hearing what someone is saying without interrupting and butting in. This is just a basic social skill, but it's a biblical skill that we should listen. We should consider a matter. It's important for us to do that. And if we are going to be effective, we need to do this. We need to say, yeah, do I actually consider what someone's saying, value this, and take it into consideration? Which is the next one here. You should, biblically speaking, the verse that precedes this one, consider other positions. You assume you know what is right, my teenager, but don't assume you know everything is right. The biblical principle here is you should actually seek understanding of what other people might be saying and weigh the matter. Weigh the matter in your mind, in prayer, and however you want to do this, consider it before you engage. We don't want just our kids walking around saying, well, this is what I heard on the internet, and so therefore it's the case. No, consider it. Right? This is what this person said they said about me behind my back. Is it true? Do you even know? Have you asked a question? Have you listened? Have you talked to that person? Have you weighed it? No, they're just going around wrathful and violent, trying to solve all these problems in their life by being aggressive. Now, respect generally, I would say, is good, but I want to just say specifically here, in all of your conduct, your kids should be respectful, which means even the societal constraints that are on us that say the society values when people talk to you with eye contact, right? That you're not slumped over in your chair with your feet up on a desk when they talk to you. The society determines these things, right? This is not a biblical principle. Don't, show your bottom of your foot to a stranger. That's not what we're talking about here. The society puts some constraints on here, but the biblical principle is you are to respect people as the society gives them some level, and as long as it's not anti-biblical, which that's a whole nother sermon, but you to provide some sort of respectful demeanor back to them. So you need to think about your kids' body language. The way that they respond to you in the car, in the house, in conversation, when they're in trouble, when you praise them, train them. Train them and say, you know what, that's not appropriate. You need to sit up, you need to look at me, you need to put the remote down, you need to put your phone away while I'm talking to you because this is important. This is how you talk to people. They need to learn that respectful body language and engagement with other people. They need to make sure that they are using appropriate language, which I know our teenagers struggle with. All over the Bible, we are called to be people that are above reproach, and we don't say anything that anybody can use as an accusation against us. We're not out there doing hateful, harmful, unkind, inappropriate speech. We're not cursing. We're not doing any of this stuff. They're using appropriate language. We're putting a guard over our mouths, we're controlling our tongues, and we're careful not to use words or phrases or things that intend to harm or that are there to be vulgar or just ruthless or whatever it would be. They need to learn these skills. The other thing is that they need to be able to have responses. Let me just say this, actually. It would be great if your kids could actually respond. When someone adult asks a teenager a question, I get this all the time. It's like deer in the headlights, like, they just stare at me. And I'm like, are you there? Oh, yeah. Well, I asked you a question, like, you want to say something? Oh, what'd you say? I'm like, wow, I don't even know what's going on right now. And like, do you want this? And like, oh. I'm like, you still haven't responded. All it is like a yes or a no. I don't understand, okay? So they need to respond, but then when they respond, they need to be controlled and they need to be thoughtful and controlled in their responses. It's a biblical principle. We're not supposed to just blurt out what we think or what we feel. We're not to vent. We're to be controlled and we're to respond. We're not to sit silently. When people ask us for the hope that's within us, we're to respond. We're to do it. And then I'll just throw one last one up here. It is a good principle for your kids to be a good, effective social engager, just biblically speaking, to be someone who can actually engage in conversation by asking questions, in continuing the conversation, right? Now, this feels to me, pastorally, like a little bit of like a worldly lesson. Like I want your kids to be engaged in society. But I just want to point out again, as we end here, what the point of this is, okay? I'll go to 1 Timothy 4. It says this. The idea of a young pastor who's in charge of a church who is struggling to feel confident in his engagement and the work that he's to do is told by the Apostle Paul to let no one despise you for the basis of your youth. Right? Your youth is not a determining factor for how people perceive you, or it shouldn't be. But the reality is, it typically is. The reason why it is because our kids don't set a good example in these areas. And when they don't set a good example in these areas, they are looked down upon. They are despised for their youth. If you want to have your teenager, who I believe can be someone who is not looked down on for being a teenager, but is actually valued, then you want to make sure that they're good at these things. And the very first thing is that they're to set as an example for other believers. That's the precursor line to this, right? They're to set for the believers an example to be a model amongst their peers for what this looks like. They're to stand above everyone else in their schools and in their programs and say, because I'm a Christian, at least by the basis, because I go to church and I hear sermons and I know the law of Christ and I know what he asked me to do, even if I haven't fully committed to Christ, I know what is right and what is wrong. Just on the basis of that, I'm going to at least try to represent these values and be an example to other people in the way that I engage with them. It's all about their engagement with other people. And the first thing that's listed is in speech. They need to be able to control their engagements in how they discuss and communicate with other people. And that's really what social engagement is all about. I want your kids to speak up, but I want them to be an example in their speech. I want them to value this. I want them to set an example so that no one would look down on them for their youth, but that they would conduct themselves in such a way that everybody would look at them and say, look at that kid. That kid stands above the rest. They're putting on a show of what it looks like to be respectful, to be honest, to have integrity, to respond. Look at the respectful body language and posture, and they're asking me questions, and they're treating me like an adult, and they're not acting like a child. Wow, they really are rising above the cultural standard that is being set. I think a lot of that has to do with your parenting and with your training and with you pushing them in their younger years up until they grow, and they're going to continue to grow in this and mature to be people that can engage in a society and be effective for Christ. So it's all of us this week as we go to our small groups, as we look at our questions, as we discuss this. Let's just think, how can we just step this up this week, identify one or two things, and let's be parents that want our kids to be effective and fruitful engagers in society just by the basis that they have the skills necessary to do so. All right, let's pray. God, we know that our kids are in the process of maturing and growing, and we know, God, that you have much more for them to grow in. We do not anticipate that our kids at their ages and their youth are arrived at any way, shape, or form. God, we know that you are still forming them and molding them. And God, we just ask that you would continue to mold them in and through our parenting to cause them to be fruitful and effective. That we want our kids to be winsome in their speech, for people to value them, to appreciate them, to not be able to say any evil thing against them, have no charge against them, because they are respectful and appropriate and engage in this society in such a way that is seeking to honor you. And so, God, I pray that you would help each of the parents here tonight as they think about this aspect of their parenting to have some good conversation, evaluation of their own parenting styles, of the things that they've been doing, things that they need to change in order to help our kids along in this matter as we seek to rise up the next generation of Christians who seek to honor you with their lives. So we just ask that you would help us tonight, and we thank you for all of this that we've gone through tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.